Hi, and welcome to the Introduction to Memory lesson. Objectives of the lesson. We will learn about the following. Why we need the ability to remember more data in our programs. We will also learn about the basic model of computer memory. And about memory devices outside the processor and memory abstraction mechanisms. Let's look at this challenge. Assume that you got this challenge maybe in one of the exercises. Write a program that receives a number n followed by n different integers. As an output, the program returns a list of the n given numbers sorted from the smallest to the largest. Try to think for a moment, how could you implement this kind of program with the knowledge that you have acquired so far? You've probably figured it out by yourself already that there is some problem here. There are some limitations. We have to remember all the numbers so we can sort them. However, we don't have enough room for all the numbers in our registers. In fact, the processor is a pretty small box. There is not so much space inside of it. We don't have enough room to remember any amount of numbers. We have to use some kind of an external device to remember all those numbers. The processor is just not enough for that. So, what's missing? So far we have created some pretty interesting programs, but they were still pretty simple. Our programs had to process the input immediately and produce output. We couldn't actually wait or delay the processing of the input. We had to process it and output immediately. We also had to struggle for space. And that is because we don't have so many registers to work with. Maybe you already had this problem, even in those beginner programs that we have written. It also seems like our programs could only keep a very small state. They couldn't remember much. If we wanted our programs to be smart, then it is pretty hard to make something look smart when you only have a few registers. We would like to be able somehow to keep and use more data in our programs. Computer's memory. The computer's memory is usually modeled as a flat list of cells. This is also known as the flat model of memory. Every cell has a name or an address. The contents of every cell could be written to or read from. This is a very simple illustration of what a memory would look like. Usually that's how people write it on paper when they refer to memory. The highest row is the address row. We can see that the numbers increase by 1 in each cell. This is actually the name or the address of every cell. And these are the actual contents of the cells. We can see that here it is bytes. Every cell contains some byte, and it is represented here in the binary base, in base 2. We can see here some arrow that points on one of the cells. For example, if this would be some kind of memory, we could, for example, read the contents of this cell by specifying its name or its address, which is 6AB4. We could read this cell and maybe even write into this cell. So we could change this value. For example, regarding the previous question about sorting some numbers that a program gets, if the program actually had access to this kind of structure, of memory structure, it could just keep all the numbers in those cells somehow, and then work using those cells. Maybe it could sort it using some kind of a bubble sort algorithm, or maybe some simple algorithm to sort the numbers. Then only finally, after the numbers are sorted in memory, the program could output the numbers one by one by reading them from the memory locations. There are different hardware implementations for memory. For example, RAM, hard disks, USB, CD, DVD, and more. The x86 processor has many instructions to communicate with the RAM. I just want to mention that usually the x86 processor only has direct access to something like the RAM, because the RAM is the fastest between all of those. You probably know that the hard disk is pretty slow, especially hard disks that are based on some physical mechanism. Newer hard disks or more modern hard disks are even faster, but the old ones are still a bit slow. Also USB and CD, DVD, all of those are not as fast as the RAM usually. So the processor has direct instructions that allow it to communicate with the RAM. Let's talk about it in a more detailed fashion. The RAM, also known as Random Access Memory. That's what the letter stands for. Random is a bit of unfortunate choice for the name of this kind of memory, because you might be thinking that it may be related to some kind of random numbers or maybe random permutations or something like that, but no. Random actually means, or that was the original intention when it was called random, that every memory cell could be accessed directly, or maybe in any random order. That means that if we want to first access some cell and then another one which is of a very different address and then a third one which has absolutely different address, then it won't take so long. There used to be memory devices that were mostly sequential. That means that those memory devices were really fast if you read one memory location and then the next one. However, it took them a very long time if you wanted to read a memory location and then a very far away memory cell. However, the RAM device allows you to read every memory cell that you want, and the speed doesn't really change. It gives you O of 1 access to the memory. It doesn't have to go over all the cells to get you the information that you want. More than a concept, the RAM is actually a piece of hardware. It looks like this, usually. Maybe if you have a different kind of computer, or maybe for laptops it's a bit smaller. This is how it usually looks like for a personal computer. At least in these days, in 2014, this is how my random access memory inside my desktop computer looks like. It is some kind of circuit that knows how to remember information. And by the way, when you take the plug off, or when you close your computer, all the memory in this device is deleted. This device can remember memory only as long as the computer is on, only as long as it has power. And this is as opposed to, for example, hard disk, which can remember even after you close the computer or disconnect it from the power supply. So the RAM is pretty fast, but it has this disadvantage that it has to get power supply to be able to keep remembering the data. It will stop remembering the data whenever you pull off the plug. The processor communicates with the RAM. You can probably see that this piece of hardware is not part of the processor. The processor is a bit smaller usually, and it doesn't have direct access to this RAM. They don't have any kind of telepathy, so they can actually agree on what they see. They have to communicate using some lines, some electric lines. The processor may send read or write requests to the RAM. The lines which transfer the data are usually called buses. Let's look at a motherboard layout. The motherboard is actually the world in which all the parts, all the electric parts inside your computer live in. It's like the water of the sea. It allows all the parts to communicate with each other. So this is an example of a motherboard. It probably belongs to a laptop. I assume that if you use a personal computer, probably your motherboard is a bit larger. We can see here a few things. This is where the processor should sit. We can see that this processor is made by AMD. We can see those letters here, AMD. We can see some other stuff here. Maybe if we already look at the motherboard layout, I can tell you some other stuff about the motherboard. This is where the memory sits. The RAM sticks. You probably remember the picture of the RAM stick that we have just seen. This picture. We have here two slots for the RAM sticks, and only one of them is taken by RAM stick. The other one is available. We can, if we wanted, add another RAM stick. We have two other important things. This is the NOS bridge, which allows to the processor to communicate with some of the other devices here. For example, memory and maybe other stuff. And this is the south bridge. Usually the north bridge and the south bridge are directly connected through some wires in the motherboard. And the south bridge allows communication with some other parts on the motherboard. So those two parts are mostly for communication. They allow different parts in this system to communicate. This is a simpler diagram of the motherboard. As you can see, it corresponds exactly to this kind of motherboard. I got it from the HP website. We can see again that this is the processor. This is the north bridge, the south bridge. And this is the memory, where you can put your RAM memory. So basically, this is really what I'm interested in for this lecture. This is the processor, this is the north bridge, and this is the RAM. Actually, I could even discard the north bridge, but I wanted you to know about it. The processor then can try to communicate with the RAM, and that's actually what usually happens. If I want to read memory or to write memory, I have to do it in a way of request. I have to send a request from the processor to the RAM, and the RAM can send a response back to the processor. Let's look at a very simple example. For example, the processor wants to know what is inside cell number DE713410. This request is somehow sent to the RAM, and the RAM responds. It says it contains the byte AB. This is a bit simplistic, maybe even too simple, but basically this is what it boils down to. It's just communication between two parts on the system. It is important for you to understand it because, for example, probably remember that the registers are actually inside the processor. They are somewhere here, inside the processor. Whenever you access a register, it is a pretty fast thing. You can read a register or write to a register and it happens very fast. However, when you access the memory, the RAM, it takes much longer because the request has to go from the processor all the way to the RAM, and then the response from the RAM has to go all the way back to the processor. So it takes some time. It is not as fast as reading or writing to a register.